Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Niall McNeil and Marcus Youssef's play Peter Panties, which is a very loose adaptation of the J.M. Barrie version of Peter Pan. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. It's a kind of absurdist or surrealist take on Peter Pan, and it's very, very intertextual. So those are some of the main things that I find really striking about the play. I do want to talk about the production process here a little bit, because in this collection, so McNeil and Youssef collaborated on at least two plays. At least two plays by the time this was published, which was 2018, so not that long ago. So they collaborated on two plays, Peter Panties and King Arthur's Knight. The way that collaboration worked is a fairly unique one, in large part because McNeil has Down syndrome, and so he generated a lot of the creative input for this. And in this collection, Youssef has given us a sort of introduction that talks through this collaborative process. So this is largely where I'm getting this information. So a lot of the creative input, the connections, the intertextuality, the musical stylings, etc., come from McNeil. And then a lot of what Youssef's role was in this is taking that material and sort of shaping it and polishing it. But Peter Panties is a really interesting take on Peter Pan, in large part because one of the things that is foregrounded in McNeil and Youssef's version is Peter's sexuality. So in J.M. Barrie's version, both the play and the novel, Peter is sexually naive. He's not interested in having female companions as lovers, even though Wendy, Tinkerbell, and Tiger Lily all have a romantic interest in him, or a sexual interest in him. But he only wants women around as mothers. So that's really interesting, because in one of the sections here, chapter 7 of this play, we have Mrs. Darling and Wendy talking. Mrs. Darling says, "Can I ask you a question?" Wendy says, "Yeah." Mrs. Darling says, "Has Peter Pan ever had sex before?" Wendy says, "I'm searching here. No." Mrs. Darling says, "This is the naive side. This is before, something naive. I just realized that. This is new territory. It's unknown." So I find that exchange really fascinating, particularly Mrs. Darling's last portion here about this being the naive side, because that's really quite central to Peter Pan's character, is this sexual naivete. I mean, he is the boy who refuses to grow up, and one of the ways that we can and should read that is a refusal, or maybe a failure, to enter into sexual maturity. But the Peter Pan that we get in McNeil and Youssef's version is very clearly not. It's not necessarily that he's not naive, but it's that he's not non-sexual or resistant to sexuality in the way that Barrie's Peter Pan is. I mean, one of the big sort of driving themes is Peter Pan's sexuality, but in many ways it's not a mature sexuality, and that to me is one of the things that's really striking about the play. So we get this in a couple of places, and I think I want to talk through this one because it's a really interesting sort of double version that we get here. So in the prologue, the latter portion of the prologue, we have a multimedia component to this, where there are projections of video from when McNeil and Youssef were making the or were collaborating on the script. So we have, in this case, an audio recording of the playwrights writing the play according to the stage directions. But I've also seen a trailer on YouTube where it seems like there's a projection of Youssef and McNeil where we actually see it. But one of the sections we have McNeil say, Peter says, "I really want to have a kid." Marcus, in here they're listed by first names, Marcus and Niall, so I'm going to go with that, I think, because it's easier, even though I've been referring to them by the last names. Marcus says, "Right." Niall says, "With you, Wendy," he says. "I really want to have a kid with you, Wendy." Marcus says, "Uh-huh." Niall says, she says, "Aw, shucks." Marcus, mishearing what Niall had said, she says, "Aw, sucks? Why does it suck for her?" Niall says, "No, that's a good thing." Marcus says, "Sucks is a good thing?" Niall says, "It's not a bad thing." Marcus says, "Okay." Niall says, "That's a lovely thing." And we go from there. This dialogue gets incorporated almost directly into the play later on in Chapter 3. And so this is one of the sort of postmodern or Brechtian elements of the play, is that we have that preview where we know that dialogue was written, and we have a we're confronted with very direct evidence that dialogue was written, and we then later see it in the play. And so that takes us out of the illusion of the play, the illusion that we could be seeing real events, which actually, because of the sort of absurdist approach that the play takes anyway, we couldn't really get that sense. But in Chapter 3, it starts when Peter says, "I want to have sex and have kids." And Mrs. Darling says, "Having sex is growing up, isn't it?" Actually, sorry, this isn't the right section. This is a different section. But I'm going to come back to this section because later we do get. Here we go. Sorry. So this is in Chapter 7. So this is a bit later in the play. Peter says, "I really want to have a kid with you, Wendy." Wendy says, "Aw, shucks." Peter says, "Why does it suck?" Wendy says, "No, aw, shucks. That's a good thing. It's a lovely thing." "Sure thing, Peter. It's totally up to you. Let's go backstage." Peter says, "Let's take off our green pants and skirts." Wendy says, "We have to keep this a secret." Peter says, "The old people are backstage." Wendy says, "They're talking about us having sex." And then we get this sort of somewhat surrealist, but at the very least sort of ritualized impregnation and birth. The stage directions say, using a hose, Peter begins to blow up a balloon in Wendy's belly, making her pregnant. And then later we get the stage direction, the balloon continues to grow, Wendy is in labor. And then later, still we get the stage direction, the now huge balloon bursts. Wendy has given birth. She produces a baby from between her legs. So, again, we've got Peter Pan as an actual father here, having impregnated Wendy, and then, at least symbolically, the pregnancy is carried through. And so this is clearly not the naive, almost asexual Peter of J.M. Barrie. And we get that earlier. To come back to the scene in Chapter 3, we have a very interesting interaction where Peter says, "I want to have sex and have kids." And Mrs. Darling says, "Having sex is growing up, isn't it?" Peter says, "So?" Mrs. Darling says, "That's not what a child wants." Peter says, "I'm 28. Mrs. Darling says, "I keep seeing aggression and I keep seeing sex." Peter says, yeah, there's sex. Mrs. Darling says, yeah, and there's aggression. Peter says, and kissing, fighting, people falling in love. What do you think about that, Mrs. Darling? I want to have kids, sex-wise. You're the mother. And then in a little bit, at the end of this scene, Mrs. Darling says, how do you know when you're too old? Peter says, well, for one, a cane or a wheelchair. You can't fly. You can't fly with those handicaps. Now, that's an interesting line, and I'll come back to that in just a second. When Mrs. Darling says, what if someone's younger at heart? Peter says, they can go, but you can't go to Neverland because I don't want you to. So here we've got enough, there's so much to unpack in this scene. This idea of the childlike nature of Peter. Because again, in Barrie's version, Peter is pretty much asexual. Like, he plays at being the father, but there's not a sexual component to it. It's not a romantic relationship, even when he is pretending that he is the father and Wendy is the mother of the lost boys. He is confronted repeatedly by people who desire, women who desire, or girls, in the case of Tiger Lily and Wendy, who want some sort of romantic or even sexual relationship with him, even if they're not fully aware that that's what they want. Peter is completely oblivious to this. But Peter's extremely aggressive in J.M. Barrie, and he's not as much in here. There's a little bit of violence, a little bit of aggression in this play, but in Barrie, in both the play and the novel version, Peter murders a number of people. So that idea of sex and aggression is really quite interesting, because here we're getting a lot of the sex and a little of the aggression, whereas in Barrie we get very little sex and a lot of aggression. But then the other thing that's striking here, one of the other things that's striking here is this line, but you can't go to Neverland because I don't want you to. This is another major component of Peter, is narcissism. This absolute demand that his needs be met, his desires be met, whatever he wants is the law of reality. And I've talked about this in my videos about J.M. Barrie's play and novel, how Peter manipulates reality to achieve what he wants, with little regard for anyone else. But the other thing that's striking here is this line. So when Mrs. Darling asks how you know you're old, well, for one, a cane or a wheelchair. You can't fly. You can't fly with those handicaps. Now, for the most part, I don't read Peter Panties as a particularly disability-focused play, but again, McNeil does have Down syndrome, and he has done a lot of work with disability theater, disability arts, disability activism and performance and things like this. So that's clearly something. And the other play that's in this collection, King Arthur's Knights, the original production run of that play cast a number of actors with Down syndrome. So clearly this is something that McNeil is concerned about. And so that's an interesting little line there, that with disabilities you can't fly, you can't go to Neverland. Now, I don't think that's necessarily what McNeil thinks, but that's almost certainly been a message that he would have encountered. That's almost certainly a message that people with disabilities do regularly encounter. You can't do X. And one of the big things about disability theater, of course, is that it strives to disprove those narratives. It strives to disprove the idea that people with disabilities can't do things. And, I mean, again, I think this is an absolutely brilliant play. I think it's a brilliant adaptation of Peter Pan that pulls out a lot of really interesting threads. And so, I mean, that's, to me, some great evidence that people with disabilities, people with Down syndrome, whatever it happens to be, are fully capable of being amazing artists, amazing creatives, and amazing human beings.